He was planning the wedding of the decade when his empire met a ghost. At a crowded Seoul intersection, a delivery girl tripped, scattering the contents of her life across the asphalt. Among the debris, he saw a photograph of a 5-year-old girl with his eyes, a daughter he was never supposed to know existed. And in a single heartbeat, the crown he spent a lifetime building suddenly felt like a weight he couldn't carry. Baek Do-kyun had built his world on silence, power, cold logic, and the absolute removal of weakness. As the head of the city's most feared syndicate, he believed he was untouchable behind the tinted glass of his limousine, until one clumsy accident forced him to stare at a truth he had abandoned 5 years ago for the sake of his throne. This is a story about blood loyalty, a father's awakening in the moment a man realizes that being feared by a city is nothing compared to being loved by a child. Baek Do-kyun stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of his penthouse, overlooking a Seoul that looked less like a city and more like a circuit board he alone controlled. He adjusted the cuff of his charcoal gray suit, his movements precise and devoid of warmth. In the world of the shadows, Do-kyun was known as the architect, a man who didn't just break bones, but built systems of loyalty and fear that were impossible to dismantle. He had spent 15 years scrubbing the human edges off his soul, replacing them with the cold, hard glint of marble and steel. "The guest list has been finalized," a voice drifted from the lounge. Kwon Se-yeon sat on the velvet sofa, her posture as rigid as his own. She was the daughter of the most powerful man in the National Assembly, and she was the final piece in Do-kyun's grand design. Their upcoming wedding wasn't about love, it was a merger. It was the crowning achievement of a man who had decided long ago that emotional territory was a liability. "My father expects the heads of the 3 major districts to be seated at the front. It sends a message of total unification," Se-yeon continued, her eyes never leaving her tablet. Do-kyun turned slightly, the late afternoon sun catching the silver at his temples. His movements precise and devoid of warmth. In the world of the shadows, Do-kyun was known as the architect, a man who didn't just break bones, but built systems of loyalty and fear that were impossible to dismantle. "Messages are sent through silence," Se-yeon, "not seating charts. They will sit where I tell them to sit, because they fear what happens if they stand." The air in the room was sterile, scented with expensive sandalwood and the faint, metallic tang of the city below. For Do-kyun, this was the pinnacle. He had no parents to disappoint, no siblings to protect, and no past that hadn't been buried under a decade of concrete. He lived in a vacuum of his own making, a place where the only thing that mattered was the expansion of his borders and the security of his throne. "You're thinking about the merger," Se-yeon said, standing up and smoothing her designer dress. She walked towards him, her presence like a beautiful, cold statue. "After next month, there will be no one left to challenge us. We'll be untouchable." Do-kyun looked at his reflection in the glass. He saw a man who had mastered the art of being a ghost while still being the most feared name in the underworld. "I have spent my life ensuring that no one can get close enough to hurt me," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "This wedding is the final lock on the door." He believed it. He truly believed that life was a series of tactical maneuvers and that he had finally won. There was no room in his penthouse for soft things, no photographs, no heirlooms, no memories of the girl who had once called him by his first name with a smile that reached her eyes. That version of him was dead, or so he told himself. Outside, his motorcade waited. 6 armored black sedans, a phalanx of men in earpieces, and a driver who kept his eyes fixed on the rearview mirror. As Do-kyun led Se-yeon toward the elevator, he felt the familiar weight of his own power. It was a heavy, comforting armor. He was the architect, and he had built a life where nothing could surprise him. He didn't know that 3 blocks away, a delivery girl was pedaling a bicycle toward an intersection, carrying a box that contained the one thing his architecture hadn't accounted for: the truth. The descent from the penthouse was a transition from one fortress to another. As the elevator doors hissed open in the subterranean garage, a dozen men straightened their backs, their hands folding in front of them in a unified display of subservience. Do-kyun didn't acknowledge them. He led Se-yeon to the lead vehicle, the heavy door thudding shut with the pressurized seal of a bank vault. Inside, the world was silent, filtered through charcoal-tinted glass and the scent of expensive leather. The motorcade pulled out into the neon-soaked arteries of Seoul, a black serpent cutting through the lesser traffic. Beside him, Se-yeon was back on her phone, her thumb flicking through floral arrangements as if she were planning a military campaign. Do-kyun watched the city blur by, a world he owned, yet one he rarely touched. He felt a strange, cold satisfaction. Everything was in its place. Every variable was accounted for. Then, the motorcade slowed. They reached the intersection of Gangnam-dero, where the red light glowed like a warning. Pedestrians flooded the crosswalk, a sea of tired office workers and students. Among them, a young woman on a bicycle wobbled, her back weighed down by a heavy delivery pack. She looked frantic, her hair escaping a messy ponytail as she tried to balance a cardboard box on her handlebars while navigating the crowd. Just as Do-kyun's car passed directly in front of her, the bicycle tire hit an uneven patch of asphalt. Time seemed to downshift. The woman lurched, the bike sliding from under her. The cardboard box tumbled, hitting the pavement with a hollow thud and bursting open. Personal items scattered across the blacktop, a thermos, a handful of pens, and several loose papers. The driver of the lead car let out a huff of annoyance, his hands tightening on the steering wheel as the woman scrambled to her knees, looking small and vulnerable against the grille of the armored sedan. Do-kyun watched with detached boredom until his eyes snagged on a small piece of glossy paper that had slid across the road, coming to rest flat against his passenger window. It was a printed photo. A young girl, perhaps 5 years old, was sitting on a park bench, clutching a stuffed rabbit. She was laughing, her head tilted back in a way that exposed a small, jagged dimple on her left cheek. But it wasn't the dimple that made the air vanish from Do-kyun's lungs. It was the eyes. They were dark, piercing, and framed by a specific heavy arch of the brow, the exact features that stared back at him in the mirror every morning. The woman in the street, Im-na-ri, reached out to grab the photo. For a split second she looked up, her gaze meeting the dark tint of the window. She couldn't see him, but she seemed to sense the predator behind the glass. Her face went pale, a look of pure, unadulterated terror crossing her features as she snatched the picture and retreated back into the crowd. "What is the delay?" Se-yeon asked, not looking up from her screen. "We're going to be late for the tasting." Do-kyun didn't answer. His heart, a muscle he had trained to be a stone, was hammering against his ribs. The light turned green. The motorcade began to move, rolling over the spot where the photo had just been. He looked back, his eyes searching the swarm of people until he caught a final glimpse of the delivery girls retreating back. "Stop the car," he said. His voice was a low, dangerous rasp. "Pardon?" the driver stammered, catching Do-kyun's icy gaze in the rearview mirror. "I said, stop the car," Do-kyun repeated, his hand already reaching for the door handle. The architect had just seen a crack in his foundation, and for the first time in 15 years, he felt the cold wind of the past blowing through. The motorcade did not just stop, it seized. 6 armored vehicles hissed to a halt in the middle of the green light, creating a wall of black steel that defied the laws of the city. Horns blared from the frustrated commuters behind them, but the noise died the moment the door of the lead sedan swung open. Do-kyun stepped out onto the asphalt, his movements possessed by a cold, predatory urgency. He ignored the confusion of his fiancée and the terrified stares of pedestrians, his eyes scanning the sidewalk where the girl had vanished. She was gone. The sea of humanity had swallowed her, leaving behind only the faint scent of exhaust and the lingering echo of his own heartbeat. "Sir," His lead driver, Minho, was out of the car in seconds, his hand instinctively hovering near his holster. He looked around at the chaos, his face a mask of professional concern. Is there a threat? Should we engage? Do-kyun stared at the space where the bicycle had been. His mind was a whirlwind of calculations, but for the first time in his life, they weren't about territory or profit. They were about a jagged dimple and a pair of eyes that had no business in a delivery girl's backpack.
No threat, Do-kyun said, his voice flat, though the air in his lungs felt like glass. He turned back to the car, where Si-yeon was watching him through the open door, her brow furrowed in a rare display of genuine bewilderment. Do-kyun, what on earth are you doing? She asked, her voice laced with the irritation of someone whose schedule had been insulted. We have guests waiting at the Sheila. You're causing a scene. Go on without me, he said, not looking at her. He gestured to the second car in the line. Take the security detail. I have a matter to attend to. A matter? Now? Her voice sharpened, but Do-kyun was already walking toward Minho. He leaned in close to his driver, his voice dropping to a low, lethal whisper. Listen to me carefully. I want the surveillance footage from this intersection. I want every delivery manifest for every courier company operating in this district within the last hour, and I want the identity of the woman on the bicycle. Minho blinked, his brow furrowing. The delivery girl, sir? Did she steal something? The elders will want to report if we're diverting resources for a petty theft. Do-kyun's hand shot out, gripping Minho's lapel with enough force to make the fabric groan. It was a rare break in his clinical composure. This does not go to the elders. This does not go to my fiancé. This is a private ghost hunt. If a single word of this reaches the syndicate, I will know who spoke it. Minho's eyes widened, seeing a flicker of something in Do-kyun he had never seen before. Desperation. Understood, sir. It will be handled with total discretion. Do-kyun released him and stood tall, smoothing his suit jacket as if nothing had happened. He watched the motorcade pull away, taking his carefully constructed future with it. He stood alone on the corner of the busy intersection, a king who had just glimpsed a rebellion in a single photograph. He didn't need a private investigator yet. He had an army of ghosts at his disposal. But as he looked at his own reflection in a shop window, he realized he wasn't hunting a girl. He was hunting the man he used to be and the secret that had been living in the light while he stayed in the shadows. The file arrived in less than 3 hours, a digital dossier delivered to Do-kyun as he sat in the back of a nondescript sedan, far from the prying eyes of his fiancée or his lieutenants. Minho had been thorough. The delivery girl was indeed Im Na-ri. She lived in a cramped fourth-floor walk-up in an aging district of Mapo, a place where the neon signs flickered with exhaustion and the scent of fried oil clung to the brickwork. It was a world away from the gleaming glass towers Do-kyun called home. He dismissed his driver a block away, preferring to walk the rest of the distance alone. His bespoke shoes felt out of place on the cracked pavement, and his presence drew cautious glances from the locals, but he didn't care. He found the building, a narrow structure squeezed between a laundromat and a convenience store. The stairwell smelled of damp concrete and old cooking. As he climbed, the silence of the building began to press against him, heavier than any threat he had faced in the boardroom. On the 4th floor, he stopped in front of Unit 402. A small hand-painted sign hung from the door. Jian's Castle. The name hit him like a physical blow. Baek Jian. He didn't need a blood test. The photo at the intersection had been enough, but standing at her threshold, the reality of her existence settled into his bones. He didn't knock. Instead, he leaned his head against the cool wood of the door, listening. From inside, he heard the muffled sound of a child's laughter, followed by the soft, rhythmic hum of a woman's voice. It was Nari. She was singing a lullaby he dimly remembered from a lifetime ago, before he had traded his heart for a seat at the head of the table. He stood there for a long time, a ghost haunting the life he had unwittingly forfeited. He looked down at the additional papers in the file. They told a story of a woman who had vanished overnight 5 years ago. There were no hospital records in Seoul, no paper trail of a pregnancy.
She had gone to a remote clinic in the countryside under an assumed name, paying in cash she had scraped together from selling her jewelry. She hadn't left him because she stopped loving him. She had fled because she had seen the architect rising. She had seen the blood on his hands and realized that his world was a furnace that would eventually consume anything soft. She had chosen poverty and struggle over the luxury of his empire, all to keep a little girl named Jian out of the line of fire. The realization was a bitter irony. Do-kyun had spent 5 years convinced he was building a legacy, a fortress that would last for generations. But the only true legacy he had ever created was being raised in a tiny apartment with a leaky ceiling, protected by a woman who feared him more than she feared the world. He reached out to touch the doorknob, his fingers trembling, a sensation he hadn't felt since he was a child. He was the most powerful man in the city, capable of moving markets and ending lives with a whisper. Yet standing in this dim hallway, he realized he was powerless. He had no right to enter that castle. He was the very monster she had spent 5 years hiding from. The following morning, the sky over Seoul was a bruised purple, heavy with the threat of rain that matched the cold knot in Do-kyun's chest. He did not go to the office. He did not answer the frantic messages from Se-yeon regarding the seating arrangements for their engagement gala. Instead, he sat in a silver sedan, the kind of unremarkable car he usually used for surveillance of rival lieutenants, parked at the edge of a small, weathered playground in Mapo. He watched through the glass, his fingers tracing the rim of a paper coffee cup he hadn't touched. Then he saw them. Nari appeared first, looking exhausted in a faded denim jacket. Her bicycle leaned against a fence. Beside her, a small blur of energy in a bright yellow raincoat skips toward the sandpit. It was Jian. Up close, the resemblance was no longer just a suspicion. It was an indictment. She had a sharp, observant gaze and the same stubborn set of the jaw that had carried him through the bloodiest years of his rise to the head of the table. For the next 2 hours, the man who held the city's underworld in a stranglehold conducted a different kind of stakeout. He watched Jian struggle to climb a plastic slide, her tiny brows furrowing in a concentration that looked hauntingly familiar. He watched her fall, brush the sand from her knees with a stoic silence, and try again. Each time she succeeded, she looked to Nari for a smile. And each time, Nari provided it, with a warmth that Do-kyun hadn't felt in a decade. The realization settled over him like a suffocating shroud. While he had been calculating interest rates and orchestrating hostile takeovers, this entire universe had been expanding without him. He had spent his prime building a throne of glass, a beautiful, transparent structure that offered a view of everything, but provided no warmth, no legacy, and no safety. He had prioritized a world where everyone bowed, but no one loved, while his daughter was learning the shape of the world on a cracked playground. He looked at his hands, the skin smooth and well manicured, yet they felt heavy with the weight of 5 years of absence. He had missed the first steps, the first words, the first time she had been brave enough to face the dark. He was a billionaire, a kingmaker, and a shadow architect. Yet in this moment, he felt like the poorest man in Seoul. A group of other parents sat on a nearby bench, chatting about preschools and teething, their lives messy and loud. Do-kyun realized with a sharp physical ache that he was a ghost among the living. He had built his life to be untouchable, but in doing so, he had ensured that he would never be touched by the only thing that truly mattered. As the first drops of rain began to fall, Nari scooped Jian up, the child's small arms wrapping around her neck in a gesture of absolute trust. Do-kyun gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. He wanted to step out. He wanted to claim them. But as he watched them hurry away, seeking shelter from the storm he had indirectly helped create, he stayed in the shadows. He wasn't a father, he was a threat. And as he watched the yellow raincoat disappear around a corner, he realized that the hardest part of his ghost hunt wasn't finding them, it was realizing he was the monster they were running from. The engagement gala was less than 72 hours away, and the air in the Quan estate was thick with the scent of lilies and cold ambition. Quan Se-yeon stood in the center of the ballroom, surrounded by event planners in silken fabric, but her focus was not on the decor. She was staring at her phone. For the third time that day, Do-kyun's personal line had gone straight to voicemail. In their world, silence was never just silence. It was a tactical shift. Se-yeon was not a woman who relied on intuition. She relied on data. She had grown up in the halls of political power, learning early that a man who suddenly seeks solitude is a man who is hiding a flank. Do-kyun had always been a creature of rigid habit, a machine of clockwork precision. But since that afternoon at the intersection, the gears had jammed. He was missing meetings, neglecting the syndicate's counsel, and most unforgivably, he was looking at her as if she were a stranger in his penthouse.
"The catering staff needs your final approval on the sea bass," a planner chirped, but Se-yeon silenced her with a single, sharp raise of her hand. She turned to her personal assistant, a man whose primary job was to navigate the gray areas of her father's political rivals. "He isn't at the office," she said, her voice a low, dangerous hum, "and he isn't with his lieutenants. Find out where he's taking the silver sedan, not the armored one, the ghost car." "Miss Kwan, Mr. Beck's security is formidable," the assistant whispered. "If he finds out we are tracking him—" "He won't," she interrupted, her eyes narrowing until they were like shards of black glass. "Don't use his men. Use the mercenaries my father keeps on the payroll in Incheon. I want to know who is worth the architect's time. If there is a woman, I want her name. If there is a secret, I want it in a folder by midnight." Se-yeon turned back to the mirror, smoothing the lace of her white gown. She didn't love Do-kyun in the traditional sense, but she owned the future they had built together. In her mind, their marriage was a fortress, and any crack in the foundation was a threat that had to be neutralized. She viewed herself as a guardian of their joint legacy, and she had no qualms about burning down a few city blocks to keep the walls standing. By the time the sun began to dip below the horizon, the wheels were in motion. While Do-kyun was sitting in the rain, lost in the guilt of a father's missed years, a darker force was beginning to descend upon Mappo. The mercenaries didn't have Do-kyun's sudden, flickering conscience. They didn't see a yellow raincoat or a jagged dimple. They saw targets. As Se-yeon sipped her tea, watching the rain streak down the windows of her father's mansion, she felt a sense of returning control. She believed she was protecting her marriage. She didn't realize she was pointing a loaded gun at the only heart Do-kyun had left. The hunt for the truth had officially turned into a hunt for a girl named Jian, and the throne of glass was about to be shattered by the very hands that helped build it. The rain had turned from a drizzle into a relentless downpour by the time Do-kyun reached the fourth-floor landing of the Mappo walk-up. He stood before the door marked Jian's Sassel, his expensive wool coat darkened by the storm, looking less like a king and more like a man drowning on dry land. He didn't knock with the authority of a boss. He tapped with the hesitation of a beggar. When the door finally creaked open, the warmth from within, scented with laundry soap and toasted rice, spilled into the cold hallway. Nari stood there, her face illuminated by a dim hallway light. The moment she recognized him, the color drained from her lips, and her hand flew to the doorframe to steady herself. "Get out," she whispered, her voice trembling with a feral protective instinct. "How did you find us? How dare you come here?"
"Nari," Do-kyun said, his voice a low rasp that felt foreign even to him. "The photo, at the intersection. I saw her." Nari's eyes darted toward the living room, where the soft glow of a cartoon played on a small television. She stepped out into the hallway and pulled the door shut behind her, shielding her daughter from his very shadow. She has nothing to do with you. You made your choice 5 years ago. You chose the throne. You chose the blood. I didn't know, he countered, stepping closer, his presence inadvertently looming. If I had known there was a child, things would have been different. Nari let out a sharp, bitter laugh that cut deeper than any blade. Different? How? Would you have raised her in that glass cage of yours? Would you have taught her how to negotiate with murderers before she learned to ride a bike? You are the architect, Dokyan. You build prisons and call them empires. She moved closer, her fingers stabbing into his chest, right over his hammering heart. To the world, you're a god, but to us, you're the monster under the bed. You're the reason I wake up screaming at 3 in the morning when a black car idles too long outside. You're the reason I changed my name, my life, and my future. You think you have a right to be a father just because you share her DNA? A father is the man who stays when things get complicated. You're just a man who complicates things until they break. Dokyan reached out, his fingers twitching as if to touch her shoulder, but he pulled back as if burned. The weight of her words was a suffocating truth. He looked at the closed door, imagining the little girl in the yellow raincoat on the other side. I want to protect her, he said, his voice breaking. Protect her, Nari's eyes flared with a desperate, terrifying clarity. The only thing she needs protection from is you. Your life is a magnet for violence. If you truly loved her, you'd walk down those stairs and never look back. You'd stay dead to us, just like you've been for 5 years. She turned the handle, her hand steady now with the resolve of a mother who had already faced her worst fear. Go back to your wedding, Dokyan. Go back to your queen. Leave the ghosts alone before you turn us into real ones. The door clicked shut, the lock turning with a finality that echoed through the empty hallway. Dokyan stood in the dark, the architect of a world that no longer had room for him, realizing that the only way to be a hero in his daughter's story was to remain the villain who stayed away. The day of the wedding arrived, with a sky the color of a bruised lung, oppressive and heavy. The Grand Hyatt's ballroom was a fortress of white lilies and black-clad security, a masterpiece of the architect's own design. Dokyan stood in a private suite, his reflection a stranger in a tuxedo that felt like a shroud. He moved to adjust his silk tie, but his hands remained still. All he could feel was the phantom weight of a small door in Mappo clicking shut. The door to the suite opened, but it wasn't his best man or a tailor. It was Park, his second-in-command, a man who had survived a decade in the Syndicate by being more shadow than human. Park didn't bow. He leaned against the doorframe, his expression unreadable. The Kwan family is pleased, Park said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. The merger is minutes away, but there is a small matter of house cleaning to attend to before the vows. Dokyun's internal sensors, honed by years of surviving coups, screamed a warning. Speak plainly, Park. Park stepped into the room, tossing a grainy, high-resolution photo onto the vanity. It wasn't the one Dokyun had seen at the intersection. It was a fresh shot, taken from a high angle, showing Neri and Jian walking to a convenience store just an hour ago. Crosshairs had been digitally etched over the yellow raincoat. The elders were concerned about your recent excursions, Park said, his voice devoid of pity. And the Kwan family doesn't appreciate liabilities. They think a man with a secret family is a man who can be leveraged. They've decided that for the architect to truly lead, the foundation must be cleared of old debris. The air in the room turned to ice. Dokyun didn't reach for his cane. He reached for the edge of the table to keep the world from tilting. Where are they? A cleaning crew has been dispatched to Mappo, Park replied, checking his watch with clinical indifference. They'll be arriving just as you exchange rings. It's a gift, really. By the time you're a married man, you'll be a man with no past to haunt him. The realization hit Do-kyun with the force of an executioner's blow. This wasn't just a wedding, it was a cage. He had built this syndicate to be a machine of absolute efficiency, and now that machine was turning its blades toward the only two people who made his heart beat. The throne of glass wasn't just cold, it was a trap designed to shatter the moment he tried to step off it. He looked at the photo of Jian, her small hand tucked into Nari's. He had spent his life thinking that power was the ability to control others. He realized now that true power was the courage to burn down everything he had built to save what actually mattered. "The elders made a mistake," Do-kyun said, his voice dropping to a frequency that made the glass on the vanity vibrate. "What mistake is that?" Park asked, his hand drifting toward the weapon concealed in his jacket. "They assumed I still cared about the throne." In one fluid motion, Do-kyun didn't head for the ballroom. He turned toward the service exit, the architect already calculating the fastest route to Mapo, knowing that if he didn't make it in time, the wedding of the decade would end in the only blood he couldn't live with on his hands. The tuxedo jacket was discarded in the service hallway, a useless piece of armor from a life that had finally turned lethal. Do-kyun burst into the underground garage, his presence a silent explosion. He didn't take the armored limousine, it was too slow, too tracked, too much a part of the machine. Instead, he seized the keys to a high-performance motorcycle kept by one of the junior guards. The engine roared to life, a mechanical scream that echoed the sudden, violent clarity in his chest. He tore out of the Hyatt, the tires screeching against the wet pavement as he bypassed the main gates. Behind him, the panicked shouts of his security detail faded into the wind. He knew the protocol. The moment he broke rank, the hit on Mapo would be accelerated. To the syndicate, he was now a rogue element to be cauterized along with the distractions. He carved through the Friday night traffic like a surgeon's blade. Rain lashed at his face, blurring the neon signs of the city into streaks of cold fire. Every red light was a gamble with death, but the only image in his mind was a yellow raincoat and a door that shouldn't have been locked. He checked his side mirror and saw them, two black SUVs, the cleaning crew that had been waiting for the signal at the wedding. They weren't just going to Mapo anymore, they were hunting him too. The chase hit the bridge, a high-speed ballet of steel and desperation. The SUVs tried to flank him, the heavy vehicles swaying as they attempted to grind him into the concrete barrier. Do-kyun didn't flinch. He leaned the bike dangerously low, feeling the spray of the Han River below, and threaded the needle between a moving truck and the lead pursuer. A window rolled down, a muzzle flashed, the sound of gunfire was swallowed by the storm. He didn't fire back. He couldn't afford to slow down. He navigated the narrow alleys of Mapo with a reckless precision that only a man with nothing left to lose could summon. He skidded the bike to a halt at the base of the walk-up, the tires smoking in the damp air. He didn't take the stairs one at a time. He ascended the 4 flights in a frantic blur, his heart a hammer against his ribs. He reached the 4th floor just as 2 men in tactical gear were raising a heavy battering ram against Unit 402. "Step away from the door," Do-kyun commanded, his voice a low, terrifying growl that carried the weight of a decade of command. The men turned, surprised to see their boss, the architect himself, standing there in a ruined dress shirt, drenched and bleeding from a graze on his shoulder. For a second, their training wavered. They saw the legend, not the target. "The order came from the elders, sir," one stammered, his hand going to his sidearm. "The elders aren't here," Do-kyun said, stepping into the dim light. "But I am." The violence that followed was short, brutal, and intimate. It wasn't the clean, detached strategy of a boardroom. It was the raw, primal rage of a father protecting his nest. When the hallway finally fell silent, Do-kyun stood over the fallen men, his knuckles split and his breath coming in ragged gasps. He turned to the door, the wood scarred by the ram. He didn't tap this time. He pressed his palm against the surface. "Nari, open the door. We have to go now." The lock turned. Nari stood there, clutching a wide-eyed Jian to her chest. She looked at his blood-stained shirt, at the carnage in the hall, and then at his eyes. For the first time, she didn't see the architect. She saw a man who had burned his world down just to stand in her doorway.
"The car is downstairs," he said, reaching out a shaking hand. "I'm taking you out of this city. I'm taking you somewhere the shadows can't reach." Nari looked at Jian, then back at him. She didn't ask about the wedding or the empire. She simply took his hand. He led them down the stairs, leaving the crown and the throne behind in the dark, choosing the chaos of the run over the silence of the grave. The salt air of the East Sea was a different kind of silence than the sterile vacuum of a Seoul penthouse. It was a living, breathing quiet, filled with the rhythmic pulse of the tide and the distant cry of gulls. In the small fishing village of Sukcho, the man known as the architect had long ago ceased to exist. Here, he was simply Beck, the man who ran the small boat repair shop on the pier, a man whose hands were now permanently stained with grease and sea salt, rather than the phantom chill of ink and iron. Do-kyun sat on a weathered wooden bench outside his shop, watching the sun begin its slow dip toward the horizon. He wore a faded linen shirt, the sleeves rolled up to reveal scars that told a story he no longer shared. The silver at his temples had spread, and the sharp, predatory edge of his gaze had been softened by years of looking at things that were meant to be built, not broken. A sudden, joyful shout broke his reverie. "Appa, look!" He turned, a genuine smile, one that actually reached his eyes, breaking across his face. Jian, now 7 years old, came racing across the sand, her yellow raincoat replaced by a light summer dress patterned with sunflowers. She was holding a sea-worn piece of green glass as if it were a rare emerald. She skidded to a halt in front of him, her chest heaving with the exertion of her discovery. "It's smoothed down by the waves," she explained breathlessly, pressing the treasure into his palm. "It used to be sharp, but the ocean made it soft, like a jewel." Do-kyun looked at the glass, then at his daughter. He thought of the throne he had walked away from, the wedding that never happened, and the empire that likely devoured itself in his absence. He had spent 40 years believing that power was found in the ability to command a city, to instill fear, and to build walls that no one could scale. He had been wrong. True power was the weight of the small, warm hand that now slid in his. It was the trust of a child who didn't know he had once been a monster. It was the quiet nod Nari gave him from the doorway of their small cottage up the hill, her hair windswept and her expression peaceful. They weren't billionaires, and they weren't untouchable, but for the first time in his life, Do-kyun was not a ghost. "It's beautiful, Jian," he murmured, closing his hand over the glass. He stood up, his knees creaking slightly, a human sound he had learned to accept. As they walked toward the house together, he didn't look back at the horizon or the road that led to the city. He didn't miss the cold perfection of his old life. He had traded a crown of glass for a life of wood and salt. And as Jian swung his hand back and forth, he realized that the architect had finally finished his greatest work. He hadn't built a fortress. He had finally built a home. The ordinary day was fading into an ordinary night, and as the lights of the village began to flicker on, Do-kyun knew that this, the simple, fragile, chaotic reality of a father, was the only empire worth ruling. Your perspective matters. Share your thoughts in the comments. We read every one. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to the channel and let us know what stood out to you. Your support helps us bring you more high-quality, gripping stories. Stay connected. More intense and unforgettable stories are coming.